For nearly 6 decades, one voice has defined an entire era of popular music. That falsetto, soaring over disco bass lines and aching ballads alike, belongs to Sir Barry Gibb, the last surviving member of the Bee Gees. But long before the glitter balls and the Grammy statues, there was a little boy from a small island in the Irish Sea who nearly didn't make it past his own childhood, and a woman who would later become the one constant in a life defined by fame, loss, and reinvention. This is the story of Barry Gibb and of Linda Gray, the wife who has stood beside him for more than 50 years. Barry Allen Crompton Gibb was born on September 1st, 1946, on the Isle of Man, a small island nestled between England and Ireland. His parents, Hugh and Barbara Gibb, had roots in Manchester, and the family already had one daughter, Leslie, before Barry arrived. Music ran in the family from the very start. Hugh Gibb worked as a drummer and band leader, performing at hotels and local venues around Douglas, and young Barry grew up watching his father behind the kit. It didn't take long for that early exposure to take hold. Barry has often said that music was simply always present in his childhood home, and it shaped him before he even understood what it meant to be a musician. 3 years after Barry was born, his parents welcomed twin boys, Robin and Maurice, in December 1949. The three brothers would eventually go on to become one of the most successful vocal groups of all time, but as children in Douglas, they were simply a rowdy, music-obsessed household with a father who encouraged every bit of it. Barry's childhood was not without hardship. As a very young boy, he was involved in a serious accident that left him with severe burns after boiling water spilled on him, and he required an extended hospital stay to recover. It was a frightening ordeal for a small child, and it left an early impression of pain and resilience that Barry has referenced in later interviews about his upbringing. The Gibb family moved several times during Barry's early years, first within the Isle of Man and then, in 1955, to Manchester, England. The shift from a quiet island community to a large industrial city was a significant adjustment, but it placed Barry directly in the middle of a booming British music scene. Rock and roll was taking over the airwaves, and Barry, like so many teenagers of his generation, became fascinated by artists such as Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. By 1957, Barry and his younger twin brothers had formed a skiffle-inspired group with 2 neighborhood friends, calling themselves the Rattlesnakes. Skiffle, with its blend of folk, jazz, and blues played on simple homemade instruments, was the sound of the moment in Britain, and it was the same scene that would soon produce the Beatles. According to family lore that has been repeated in numerous retrospectives over the years, the Rattlesnakes were booked to lip-sync to a record at a local cinema event, and when the record broke just before showtime, the boys had no choice but to perform live for the first time. The crowd's enthusiastic response gave the brothers their first real taste of what performing could feel like, and there was no turning back after that. In 1958, the Gibb family made a much bigger move, emigrating from England to Redcliffe, Queensland, in Australia. It was there that Barry, Robin, and Maurice began performing under a new name. The group eventually became known as the Bee Gees, a name widely understood to reference Barry Gibb's initials alongside those of a few early supporters who helped the brothers get noticed on Australian radio. The path to stardom wasn't instant. The brothers spent years honing their sound, working through different musical styles before finding their voice. Their first big breakthrough in Australia came in 1966 with the song Spicks and Specks, which became a major hit and convinced the family it was time to try their luck back in Britain. The Bee Gees returned to England in 1967 and soon signed with manager Robert Stigwood, landing a deal that placed them with Polydor Records in the UK and Atco Records in the United States. Songs like To Love Somebody and New York Mining Disaster 1941 introduced the group's lush harmonies to an international audience, and by the following decade the brothers had reinvented themselves entirely, becoming the defining sound of the disco era with global smashes such as Stay Alive, Night Fever, and How Deep Is Your Love. Before any of that global success arrived, though, Barry had already lived through a brief first marriage. In 1966, at just 19 years old, he married Maureen Bates. The marriage did not survive the pressures of a young, rapidly rising music career, and the couple divorced in 1970, several years after the Bee Gees had relocated back to England. Very little detail about that early relationship has ever been made public, and Barry has rarely discussed it at length in interviews. but it marked a chapter of his life that closed just as an entirely different one was about to begin. It was on the set of the British music program Top of the Pops in 1967 that Barry Gibb first crossed paths with Linda Gray. At the time, the Bee Gees were riding high on the success of their song Massachusetts, and Linda, a young Scottish woman who had recently been crowned Miss Edinburgh, was working as a model and had been asked to serve as the show's hostess that week. By Barry's own account in later interviews, there was an immediate and unmistakable spark between them the moment their eyes met across the studio. Rather than any grand romantic gesture, Barry simply asked Linda for tea, and that small, understated invitation turned into a relationship that has now lasted well over half a century. The two dated for roughly 3 years, while Barry's career and personal life underwent enormous changes, including the end of his first marriage. In September 1970, on Barry's 24th birthday, the couple married at Caxton Hall in London. It was a milestone that arrived just 2 months after Barry's divorce from Maureen Bates had been finalized, marking a fast and decisive turn toward a relationship that would go on to define the rest of his life. Unlike so many marriages forged inside the entertainment industry, Barry and Linda's bond did not fade under the pressure of fame. As the Bee Gees became one of the biggest acts on the planet through the 1970s, touring constantly and recording some of the best-selling albums in music history, Linda chose a different path than the spotlight. She stepped back from her own modeling and television career to build a family life that stayed as grounded and private as possible, even as her husband's face appeared on magazine covers around the world. Barry and Linda welcomed their first child, a son named Stephen, in 1973, 3 years after their wedding. Ashley followed in 1977, Travis in 1981, Michael in 1984, and their only daughter, Alexandra, arrived in 1991. Raising 5 children while Barry remained one of the most in-demand performers in the world was no small task, but by most accounts from those close to the family, Barry made a consistent effort to be present, scheduling his life around his children whenever he could and treating fatherhood as a priority equal to his musical career. Several of the Gibb children went on to pursue music themselves, though often in strikingly different directions from their father's signature sound. Stephen became a guitarist known for his work in hard rock and metal bands, including Black Label Society, Crowbar, and Saigon Kick, a far cry from the polished harmonies of the Bee Gees. Ashley came to songwriting somewhat later, reportedly discovering a passion for it after writing a song of his own, and eventually collaborated with his father on various projects. Barry has spoken about including his sons in his creative work over the years, notably during his 2005 collaborative album with Barbra Streisand, Guilty Pleasures, and again on his 2016 solo record In the Now, both of which involved contributions from members of his family. Through it all, those who have covered the Gibb family closely describe Linda as the steady center of the household, the person who ensured that even amid world tours and constant media attention, the children grew up with a sense of normalcy. Their son Ashley has spoken publicly about how strong his parents' bond has remained, remarking in a televised interview that their affection for one another today looks much the same as it did when they were young. One of the more striking threads running through Barry Gibb's public reflections on his life is how consistently he credits Linda with helping him avoid the darker pitfalls of fame. The music industry of the 1970s and 1980s was notoriously unforgiving, and substance abuse claimed a devastating toll among many of Barry's peers, including, tragically, 2 of his own brothers. Barry has said in interviews that Linda's steadiness and the priorities she helped him keep, his family, his faith in the work itself, and a sense of humility, kept him from following the same destructive patterns that affected people around him. That is not to say fame never presented temptation. Barry has spoken candidly in past interviews about periods when other well-known figures showed romantic interest in him, including a story involving Australian tennis star Yvonne Goolagong. Yet has consistently maintained that a commitment to Linda never wavered. In multiple interviews across the decades, he has described her not simply as his wife, but as his closest friend and the one figure in his life whose place could never be taken by anyone else. In 2017, ahead of a headlining performance at England's Glastonbury Festival, Barry gave an interview to Radio Times in which he revealed something he said he had never spoken about publicly before, that at around 4 years old, he had been the target of an attempted sexual assault by a man who was later arrested. Gibb was careful in how much detail he shared, saying only that the man never actually touched him, but that other troubling things happened, both to him and to other children he knew at the time. He described one particularly vivid memory from that period: being a small child in bed in the early hours of the morning while a police officer questioned him about what had happened. Gibb acknowledged in that same interview that he had gone back and forth over whether revealing something so old and painful was the right choice, given how many decades had passed. But he also made clear that the memory had never faded, remaining as sharp to him as if it had happened recently. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from an artist who had spent a public life mostly associated with falsetto hooks and disco anthems rather than personal hardship, and it added an unexpectedly somber dimension to the story of a man whose childhood had already been marked by a serious accident and a family life defined by constant upheaval and relocation. Perhaps no aspect of Barry Gibb's life has been more publicly documented or more painful than the loss of all three of his younger brothers. Andy Gibb, the youngest of the four Gibb boys and a solo pop star on his own, right thanks to hits like I Just Want to Be Everything and Shadow Dancing, struggled for years with substance abuse that took a serious toll on both his health and his career. Despite efforts by his family, including Barry, to help him recover, Andy died in March 1988 from myocarditis, a heart condition that had been worsened by years of drug use. He was just 30 years old. Barry has said in later interviews that Andy's death left a wound that never fully closed, and that he often wondered whether there was more he could have done. 15 years later, in January 2003, Barry's twin brother Maurice died suddenly following complications from emergency surgery for a twisted intestine. He was 53. Because Maurice and Barry had spent virtually their entire lives side by side, first as brothers and then as bandmates for decades, the loss hit particularly hard. Barry has said that for a period after Maurice's death, performing Bee Gees material felt too painful to continue. Then, in May 2012, Robin Gibb, Maurice's twin, and the last of Barry's three brothers, died at 62 after a long battle with cancer. With Robin's passing, Barry became the sole surviving member of the group that had defined his entire adult life. He has spoken since then about grappling with survivor's guilt, the strange and heavy feeling of being the one left standing after building a career and a life alongside three brothers who are all now gone. Through each of these losses, those close to the family have described Linda as an unwavering source of stability for Barry, someone who helped him process grief without letting it consume him. In interviews given years after Robin's death, Barry has referred to his marriage and his surviving family as the things that kept him tethered during periods when the weight of losing so many people so close to him might otherwise have been unbearable. What makes Barry and Linda Gibb's marriage particularly notable is simply how long it has lasted in an industry that is famously hard on relationships. Married in 1970, they have now been together for well over 50 years, weathering not just the pressures of the Bee Gees' meteoric rise, but also the deaths of three brothers, the raising of 5 children, and the ordinary strains that come with any long marriage. Friends and family members close to the couple have often pointed to Linda's decision early on to step out of the public eye as a key reason their relationship endured where so many celebrity marriages have not. Rather than compete with Barry's fame, she built a life alongside it, prioritizing their children and their home over public appearances. Barry, for his part, has never been shy about crediting Linda for much of the stability in his life. In interviews given throughout his career, he has repeatedly returned to the same idea, that behind the global success, the sold-out arenas, and the decades of hit records, the truest achievement in his life has been building a lasting family with the woman he met by chance on a television set in 1967. Their children and grandchildren today reflect a family life that, for all its exposure to global fame, managed to stay remarkably intact. To understand why Linda's steadiness meant so much to Barry, it helps to understand just how enormous the Bee Gees became in the years after their return to England. Following the international breakthrough To Love Somebody and New York mining disaster in 1941, the brothers spent the late 1960s and early 1970s building a catalog of soft rock ballads that showcased their layered harmonies. Then came the shift that would define them forever. As disco began to take hold of dance floors around the world, the Bee Gees reworked their sound entirely, embracing falsetto vocals, driving rhythm sections, and a dance-oriented production style that culminated in the soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever in 1977. That soundtrack and the songs on it became one of the best-selling records in music history, transforming Barry, Robin, and Maurice from successful pop songwriters into global superstars almost overnight. That level of fame came with a punishing schedule. Touring, recording, and constant media obligations left the brothers with little time for ordinary life, and the pressures of maintaining that level of success took a visible toll on many people in their orbit. It was during this exact period, the mid to late 1970s stretching into the 1980s, that Barry has said Linda's presence mattered most. While the band's popularity soared and then, inevitably, faced backlash as disco fell out of fashion by the early 1980s, Barry's home